Yeah, I think it's a really interesting possibility to think that stories are a particularly ideal mode of communication for humans. Um, and why that is something that I am very interested in. Here, what we're trying to do with this study is kind of see if by having people read stories and measuring their lasting influence, we can kind of gain some insight into how and why stories are so particularly memorable. Why do they form this kind of lasting impression on us that persists for some time after? Hi, my name is Buddhika, and I'm a postdoc at Johns Hopkins University. And today, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a new research project of ours where we look at how stories can have a lasting ability to shape our spontaneous thoughts. Stories are interesting because they have this ability to transport us into alternate worlds. For example, when you read a book, it's not just words on a paper, those words are actually evoking entire expansive and immersive alternate worlds in our minds. And when you read other kinds of information, for example, a paragraph in a textbook or a recipe, they don't really evoke alternate worlds and transport us in the same way that stories seem to be able to. Stories also have this ability to linger in our minds even after they end. Take, for example, a novel you really love or a movie you really enjoyed. Usually, you can really feel the story sitting in your mind for minutes, hours, sometimes even days after it ends. Why are stories able to last in our minds in this way? Is it something particular about stories? And if so, how do we measure this phenomenon in the laboratory? To this end, we designed an experiment where participants read short stories online. And to measure spontaneous thought, we had our participants do a task called free association before and after reading the story. And free association just entails typing whatever words come to mind as they come to mind for 5 minutes. So, if stories have some kind of lasting ability to shape our spontaneous thoughts, you would expect some kind of change in participants' free associations after reading the story as compared to before. We were also interested in to what extent this effect depended on the overall narrative structure as compared to the constituent elements that make up the story, like its sentences or words. And to this end, we showed a separate group of participants a sentence-scrambled version of the same story, which was made up of the same sentences as the intact story, but randomly reordered, which essentially broke the narrative structure. So if stories have some kind of ability to shape our spontaneous thoughts, then you might expect this effect to be larger in the intact condition as compared to the sentence-scrambled version. We ran 480 participants, but we still needed a way to quantify the extent to which participants' free associations were actually shaped or influenced by the core themes of the story. And to this end, we turned to a technique from natural language processing called word embeddings. Word embeddings are really interesting. They give us numerical representations of how words relate to one another. With word embeddings, each word occupies a position in word space, which is similar to the three-dimensional space that we're familiar with, except with word embeddings, in our case, there were 300 dimensions. And words that have similar meaning will occupy similar positions in word space. And this word space is generated by looking at how words co-occur with one another in natural language. Take, for example, the word dog. The word dog is likely to occur in similar contexts to the word cat or bone, but it's less likely to occur in the same context as the word geometry. And for this reason, the word dog, cat, and bone might have similar positions in word space, while geometry will be far off somewhere else. We can therefore look at how close participants' free associations are to the core theme words of a story, giving us a concrete measure of the extent to which a story can exert a lasting influence on our participants' spontaneous thoughts. What we saw was that participants who read the intact story showed a significant and measurable shift in their free associations, moving towards the core themes of the story. And importantly, this was due to the narrative structure and not the constituent elements of the story, like its sentences or words, because its effect was larger for the intact condition than it was for the participants who read the sentence-scrambled versions of the same story. This effect replicated across 4 different stories, indicating that it's a general property of how stories can influence our spontaneous thoughts. So overall, we saw that participants who read the intact story showed a significant and measurable shift in their free associations, moving towards the core themes of the story. And this was something that was due to the narrative structure and not the constituent elements of the story, like its sentences or words. And this was because we saw this effect to be larger for the intact condition than it was for the participants who read the sentence-scrambled versions of the same story. The study allowed us to quantitatively measure the phenomenon of stories lingering in our mind, giving us insight into this lasting ability stories have to shape our spontaneous thoughts. That's a great question. And what we did is we opted for more of a data-driven approach. What we did is we asked our participants, after reading the story and after doing free associations, to come up with 10 words that they thought could describe the core themes of the story. So each participant that we used generated these 10 words. So then what we were able to do was take which 10 words came up most consistently across all of our participants at the end of the story. And then that allowed us to essentially identify what some of the core reliable themes of the story were and use the top 10 as the core themes of the story for our word embedding analysis. Maybe what stories do, in turn, is allow us to process information with more focus or attention on the underlying meaning of the elements. When you think of a story, it's composed of events, and not just events where you have to think about what the event means. You have to think about how the event fits with all the other events, kind of forming a network of meaning. And stories are particularly good at, I think, emphasizing the importance of meaning and implication of the information that you're processing, and maybe in turn lead to more robust representations in memory, which produce maybe this lingering, lasting mental context that we're observing.